Whether you love him or you hate him, you can't deny that this guy has made an impact for the world. And I'm assuming that you know all about his history with Microsoft, but this is more about what Bill Gates is doing after Microsoft. And one of the first things he did after leaving Microsoft was to join his wife Melinda in the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And so they have spent 7.8 billion, that's with a B, not an M, through this foundation. And their focuses have been in fighting AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria, and polio. So the foundation was started when Melinda noticed, that's Bill Gates' former wife, noticed that kids were needlessly dying in the developing world from illnesses that vaccines and cures existed for in the developing world. So much unnecessary suffering and death. Now it is estimated that they have saved 122 million lives. So just to put that into perspective, that is 5 times, roughly, of Australia's population. And after accomplishing this incredible achievement, Bill decided to pivot in his focus a little bit. Melinda is still staying the course with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, whereas Bill is deciding to more focus on climate change. And the reason for this is that he noted that climate change is by far the biggest threat to the populations of the developing world, as heat waves, rising sea levels, fires, and floods will hit the developing countries more often and harder than in the developed world. Now, part of the reason for this is a combination of geography and also developed countries having better infrastructure and things in place to reduce the consequence of the effects of climate change. So, for example, better hospitals and better emergency response capabilities and things like that. His ex-wife, Melinda, still does incredible work through that foundation, and Bill is still part of it, but his primary focus is now the Breakthrough Energy Venture. Or to abbreviate, that's just the BEV. Now, the fund is focusing on lowering emissions through 5 key sectors of carbon production and carbon equivalent production. And so, the pillars for reducing CO2 emissions and CO2 equivalents is in energy, transport, agriculture, air conditioning and heating, and finally, construction, and specifically cement of the construction side of it. So the idea of the fund is to help scientists basically develop their entrepreneurial abilities. There are roughly 60 companies under the BEV, and with this breakthrough energy venture as well, it is not only Bill Gates who is putting money into this. He's actually recruited a lot of his billionaire mates, and he's got Andrew Forrester from my home country, Australia. He has Jeff Bezos, and actually you can see on the list here just some of the other billionaires that he has recruited into this breakthrough energy venture in order which will be fighting climate change. And so it's actually pretty inspiring to see how much money is going into this green revolution, and I really look forward to some of the fruits that we're going to see from some of these investment seeds. And now I'll list out my favorite 10, starting with the top 5 in this video. Number 1, Form Energy. So Form Energy are hoping to create batteries at a fraction of the cost of what current day lithium batteries cost, in the same way that this dog here is a fraction of the size of any normal dog. And they're hoping to achieve this through making the batteries through much cheaper materials. And the materials that they're specifically using are iron and air. So the process between the anode and the cathode, that's basically the positive and the negative terminals, is a process of electrons moving from iron to rust, and then in the recharge, it's the electrons moving from rust back to iron. Now for these batteries, they are the size of roughly about a washing machine, and they have the equivalent power of what you'd find in an electric car. And it is not intended for electric cars because obviously iron is very heavy. So the ideal use for these types of batteries is to complement a renewable power station. So say things like a solar farm or a wind generator, so it can store the power for when the wind is not blowing or for when the sun is not shining. And also note that these batteries are only designed to hold charge for approximately about 100 hours. And when I say that it's cheaper, you're probably wondering how much cheaper. Well, they can store the same amount of electricity as a lithium battery for 10% of the cost of what that lithium battery would have costed for that same amount of capacity. And this isn't just pie in the sky stuff either. This is actually going through a working trial right now at the Great River Energy Corporation in the United States. And the results of this trial will decide whether this technology will be mass adopted in the future. Number 2, Source. Now I can really see this one being adopted by countries that are in the extreme early stages of their development, the military, and also the camping industry. So this concept was started in 2014 in Phoenix, Arizona, where they basically created a contraption or a machine that can convert air into water. And as one would assume, it works much better and much more efficiently in humid environments. So what this device does is that it uses its solar power, and then it powers the fans, which then force the air to come across what is known as a hygroscopic material. Hygroscopic material. Whew, that is a big word. I wish it wouldn't make me say those. And it collects all the air and then creates water molecules out of it. Now, for those of you who do know a little bit about the water and gas process, you're probably thinking that this is just a fancy dehumidifier. But no, it is not that. So a dehumidifier normally requires a lot of power, and a lot more power than what a mobile solar panel can provide. With this device, it uses far less power, and it has a much lower contamination risk as well, just as an added benefit through the way that they do it. Now, it achieves this by being able to convert air to its dew point. And so the idea is that you leave this in the sun, and you come back to it a few hours later, and then you can get a bottle of water out of it. Now, obviously, this would be great for the developing world, and especially those at the very starting points. I can actually see a potential of this of just the world's militaries, and also the camping industry, farming, and just even the remote resources industry. Just any industry or any recreational situation where you have to go to an extremely remote area where there isn't any plumbing set up. There's actually an incredible demand for this. So, going away from the source website for a moment, if we go to World Vision, they stated that in 2018, 2.1 billion, that's with a B not an M, people live without clean drinking water. And without clean drinking water, that obviously creates a lot of flow-on problems such as diseases and hygiene, and basically devastating domino effect, which is why clean drinking water is so important. The unpredictable effects of climate change coming up in the future, this technology could be great in one, solving the symptoms of this climate change for the cities that feel it the most, and two, it does it in a way that doesn't actually add to CO2 emissions. Number 3, Biomilq, and this is one that I can guarantee that you did not expect to be something that has been invested into in order to fight climate change. And so, to really simplify what these guys are doing, they're creating fake milk in a lab. And so, when I was trying to research what they actually do, they use a lot of big technical words and a lot of complicated science, which, to be honest, went really over my head. So I do apologize that I am really simplifying and dumbing down what they're doing here. But to put it in English, they looked at the process for how milk is made normally, and then they're basically just perfectly mimicking this process except in a lab and on a mass scale, where you could get a glass of milk and you could get this lab-made milk, and then put them next to each other, and from a molecular level, they're basically identical. And so no real milk will be required in this process at all. And some of you may be thinking right now, okay, yeah, that's great for the health of developing countries, but what does this do to actually fight climate change? Well, as some of you may or may not be aware, the meat industry is actually a massive contributor to CO2 and CO2 equivalent emissions. And unfortunately, the dairy industry is not immune from this either. So in the same way that there is the Impossible Burger or Beyond Meat and a whole bunch of other companies trying to do artificial meat, this company is basically trying to do it for the dairy industry. And if both of these industries were to succeed, both in the artificial meat and also in the artificial dairy, and we're able to significantly reduce the amount of livestock that is required in order for us to get our meat and our dairy, that will both decrease CO2 equivalents being let into the atmosphere, and it will also decrease an incredible amount of suffering that the animals have to go through in order to provide these products for humans. And furthermore to this, there's also other benefits in both the developed and the developing world. And is it just me, or is it... I swear that every second year I seem to be reading on the news about how there is a baby formula shortage, and so it'll prevent all of these problems. So yes, it will reduce CO2 emissions, but it also do quite a lot to address the problems that we're facing in the world of malnutrition and supply shortages at the same time. Moving on to number 4, Zeroavia. So aviation is obviously a massive emitter of CO2, and this is a much harder problem to tackle than what you would assume, as you just assume that you can copy the technology that has worked for ground transport and then apply that to aviation. But unfortunately, it does not work like this. So in aviation, the most amount of fuel is burnt because of weight. And so the amount of energy that is stored, whether it be a fuel source or a battery or a liquid fuel, the amount of energy per kilogram or the amount of energy stored per pound is very important. So, aviation kerosene is very energy intense for its weight, whereas even the best batteries in the world using the most rare and cutting edge technologies cannot match aviation kerosene as far as the amount of energy per kilogram or energy per pound. But with that being said though, the amount of energy that can be stored in and lithium batteries does compete with the amount of energy per kilogram or energy per pound that you'd find in unleaded fuel or diesel, which we use in our ground vehicles, which is why they're being mass adopted for ground transport. But unfortunately, for jet fuel, they're not even close. And even if hypothetically they could make a battery that's equally as energy intense as jet fuel, it's still not going to be suitable for use in aviation. And that is because the aircraft is only fueled to the amount that is needed for that particular flight. And then in that flight, the majority of the fuel will be burnt, because that's when they have the most amount of fuel, as they're taking off. And then once they've taken off and reached a cruising altitude, they've already burnt through the majority of the fuel, and then they're basically just cruising along, and because they burnt that fuel, the plane is now lighter, and because the plane is lighter because they burnt that fuel, they then need less fuel to go for the rest of the journey. So basically, the more of a liquid that they suck out and burn, the more fuel efficient it will become during the flight. So the plane will be most fuel efficient at the end of its flight and least fuel efficient at the start of its flight. And so if you attempt to replace liquid fuel in an aircraft with a battery, you're obviously going to ruin this benefit, because a battery, whether it's fully charged or completely drained, is going to weigh the same for both the beginning and the end of the flight. Before we just cross off aviation as an industry that we can't do anything about as far as reducing CO2 emissions, don't worry, there is some hope, and Zeroavia may be this slim glimmer of hope. What they're basically aiming to do is to remove the need for jet fuel or aviation kerosene and replace it with hydrogen electric engines. And so this tech will be incredibly hard to crack, but it'll be a game-changing technology for the world if they are actually able to crack this technology. And so how far have they come along with the technology, and what is their time frame looking at? Well, their timeline is for 2024, they're hoping to be able to do small charter flights. So think of a Cessna and planes of that scale or that size. And then by 2040, they're hoping to do the big commercial jumbo jets that fly between continents around the world. Anyway, with this, the sooner the better, and it's obviously going to be a very long and difficult road. And this is one of those ones that it's less likely to be achieved, but if it is achieved, it's going to be that much better. Technology number 5, and also the final bit of technology for this list, is 44.01. So these are a group of people who are hoping to partner with direct air capture facilities. If you do not know what direct air capture is, it's basically a process where they have these massive facilities and they suck in air, basically extracted CO2 out of it, turn it into a solid, and then release out the existing air, which is a combination of nitrogen and oxygen basically. Just to prevent anyone leaving a bit of a cheeky comment about saying, well Dave, you know that trees do this as well? Well yes, trees do this, and this basically perfectly mimics the process of a tree. However, with that being said, if you planted a tree in every available spot on the planet right now, it will not remove the amount of carbon from the air that is required to actually save us from a climate disaster. And furthermore, when things like bushfires happen, it just undoes a lot of that benefit. And a third downside about just relying on trees is that it takes about 10 to 20 years for the benefit of those trees to actually cut down carbon. And so this technology is established and it is around, and it's actually done in quite a few places. So with the direct air capture industry, there's a lot of facilities out there and they're doing great work. Except the problem is though, is that they have all this captured carbon in their filters, and they've got basically nothing really to do with it. And so this is where 44.01 come into the equation, as they offer a solution for all that gunk that they've caught in their filters. So what these guys basically do is that they get olivine and pyroxene and mix it with CO2 and water, and then it forms this new rock called serpentine. That is the greenish one. And it also creates calcite, and that is basically the whitish one that you can see here. And both of these rocks store a lot of carbon. And so now the carbon is in rocks rather than in the atmosphere. So happy days. And also when it is put into this form of rock, it can be used as concrete aggregate, or it can just be put into a quarry somewhere and forgotten about. So anyway, that's the first 5 of my favorite 10 coolest innovations that Bill Gates and his mates are investing into. Anyway, hopefully I'll see you next week.